Hi, welcome to the Holy Biblog. I'm Lindsay Mattingly, as you all know, because you're either family members or Dr. Lily. And today I am going to present some information on the rereading of the creation myth. I originally had planned to write a paper at the end of the semester, but I thought that it might be nice to do something so that I could keep all my work here on the Holy Biblog. So I'm sort of attempting to create this video the same way that one might do a classroom presentation as a final project. So today I'm going to look at some of the ways that several of our authors that I've read and written about on the Holy Biblog discuss the creation myth. I chose to do the creation myth because I think it is so well known, so ubiquitous in Western culture, and yet what I've read this semester just really revolutionizes my ideas about it, what I thought I knew about the creation myth. So I wanted to share some of that with you because I think that by examining this myth that we're also familiar with, but looking at the ways that scholars have interpreted it and really fleshed out some of its complexity, is demonstrative of the complexity of the Bible as a whole. When we can take the first 3 chapters and look at all the different things that are at play in the text and sort of see how complex it can be, it sort of sheds light on the fact that the whole Bible contains these same types of complexities. So first, let's talk about the creation story as we know it, so to speak. The modern interpretation, the thing that I was taught in my Christian faith tradition growing up, and I think what's sort of interpreted throughout Western culture, includes a lot of additions that aren't in the text. For instance, the idea that the serpent is Satan, that's nowhere written in the Bible. And we'll look more at that and some of these other things too. So in February, here's how I paraphrase sort of our understanding of the creation story, what I was taught as a child and what I believed the Bible said. Quoting myself because I'm so arrogant that way. God creates the lights, the heavens and the earth, animals and humans from nothingness. After all that, he takes a nap. Don't blame him myself. Then Adam, created not from nothingness, but rather from dirt, quickly bores up his role as first ever zoologist, so God makes him a nifty little helpmate from his rib. Adam names her from man or woman, and they live in a blissful, sinless state, where they have immortality. Then Eve, that little vixen, is tempted by Satan himself to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They realize that they're naked, and God kicks them out of the Garden of Eden for their disobedience, aka sin, and warns them that they'll toil for food and have pain in childbirth. Because of their disobedience, they and their descendants, you and me that is, are born into an awful, sinful world and subject to death. So that's sort of how I paraphrase, just off the top of my head what I think of the creation story. So first, in our dissection of the creation myth, I'd like to look at the story itself, and then we'll move on to a short analysis of some of the different players in the story. So Genesis 1 presents one version of creation. Strikingly, in Genesis 2, the Bible, sort of unconscious of this first story, restarts the story and tells it a completely different way. So the two stories represent really really different concerns, and also have starkly different narratives. The things that happen play out differently. They play out in different orders, and the text comes to different conclusions. So I'd like to lay out just a couple of the differences, just to sort of demonstrate what we're looking at. Borg and Kugel both write about these differences and lay them out really well in their text. The Borg text that I'm going to be reading from is the one I blogged about, which is reading the Bible again for the first time. And then the Kugel text is one of the two that I read from him, and it's How to Read the Bible, A Guide to Scriptures Now and Then. So they both lay out that there are there are the two stories, and they lay out the differences. The first story, which appears in Genesis 1, is referred to as the priestly text, and it was actually written second. It was written after the account that appears in Genesis 2 through 3, even though in the canonical text we read it first. The priestly account, that one that's in the first, is concerned with cosmic creation. It presents this cosmic sovereignty that's very powerful. He speaks things into existence, creates the universe, the heavens, the waters, the sky, the dry land, and then inhabits those things with the sun, the moon, the stars, the creatures, the fish of the water, the birds of the air, and then the dry land creatures. And then he creates man last. So it's sort of climactic in that he, the last thing he does is create human. And he creates human, and it says he made, significantly, this will come back into play later, but he creates them in his image, male and female, he creates them. The Yahwist account, however, completely different. In that account, God actually creates man first. So it positions it as before vegetation and animals. And I'm going to read this really quickly. I'm reading from the New Oxford Annotated Bible. And it is the New Revised Standard Edition is the interpretation, excuse me, here that I am reading. And it says, "In the day that the Lord made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for God had not caused it to rain, ... Then the Lord formed," verse 7, "then the Lord formed man from dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living thing." So, I'm just checking myself here. Excuse me. In the priestly account, man and woman are created simultaneously, while in the Yahwist account, Adam is created first, and then later Eve comes from his rib. Something else that I want to know, that kind of threw me off there, is that the biblical text is concerned here with describing the earth, and it says, for no one, it hadn't rained yet. There were no herbs or plants growing because there was no one to till the ground. So I think that's really important. It's something we're going to come back to in just a moment. I do want to wrap up sort of what I found fascinating about what Borg says, and that is two things that he points out, which are the poetic form of this first creation story. He suggests that this version was created as a doxology, which a doxology is a hymn of praise about the glory of God. So from a historical perspective, Borg writes that scholars mainly agree that this text was written during Babylonian exile. So it was written perhaps by a priest as an assertion of the God of Israel as the creator and ruler of the heaven and earth, and further as a victorious God. For in ancient societies, when two nations would war, the victorious nation, their gods were viewed as being the victors over the defeated nation's gods or God. Therefore, Borg asserts that this first creation myth, the priestly version, was created probably in exile as a way for a priest to assert the power of the God of Israel as the true God, and to declare that their God was greater than the God of their victors. So that's why it sort of has this poetic feel. He writes that three phrases are repeated 7 times. The phrase, "God said, let there be," the phrase, "and it was so," and the phrase, "and God saw that it was good." So it has this very strong poetic nature and poetic language, and it relies on metaphor because it's a hymn of praise. And Borg writes that what's important is not that a hymn is not meant to be taken as literal truth, but holds great truth. So for Borg, that's where I think a lot of the significance of the creation story for modern readers still resides, in that it doesn't, although it's not literal truth and it doesn't need to be to Borg, it contains great truth in its poetic nature. One thing I do want to note, those three phrases, God said, let there be, and it was so, and God saw that it was good. God says that all of his creation is good. The heavens and the earth, the light, the creatures of the land. The one time that God does not say, or the text, does not say, and God saw that it was good, is upon the creation of humankind. He never says that they're good. He does say later in Genesis that he regrets making them. So I found that really fascinating, just sort of as an aside. But I do want to move on to what Kugel has to say about the creation story. And Kugel, again, Kugel and Borg, the texts really overlap. Their texts really overlap. They both really take on the fact that there are two separate stories, and they really flesh out some of their differences and come to conclusions, very similar conclusions, about what the motives were for creating these two stories. So in Kugel, he looks at the first, the Genesis 1, the priestly document, as an assertion of God's power and an affirmation also of the importance of the Sabbath. If you read the text, it all happens in 6 days. It's very specific about the fact that it all happens in 6 days, and then that on the 7th day, God stops and he rests. So this would have been sort of the priest way to affirm the ritual of Sabbath, and to say that if God took a rest, then the Sabbath as a day of rest is endowed with divine authority, divine holiness, and God's holiness thus sort of resides within Sabbath because it is so holy and because it is recognized in the first chapter of the Hebrew Bible as something that God does. So I want to look at how Kugel treats the second story. And what we find here is not sort of this powerful cosmic sovereign deity who speaks things into existence, rather what Kugel calls a craftsman. In this one we have a very anthropomorphic God who is very hands-on in his creation. Instead of just saying light and sea and sun and all these things happening, he really grabs things and does them himself, and he's endowed with some anthropomorphic features. He walks through the garden, and we hear him walk, or Adam and Eve hear him walk, and he plants a garden. He picks up the dust from the ground and makes Adam, and then breathes life right into him. And he'll engage in some other humanly activities that we'll talk about as well. And the second thing that I think that Kugel explores is the concerns of these two stories, whereas the first one's concerned with asserting the sovereignty of God. The second one is much more concerned with anthropology, actually. It's a close tracking of, a close discussion, rather, of the creation of humans, and it tracks this transition of humanity from the hunter-gatherer society to the farming society. Kugel writes, one interesting theory to emerge of late is that the story seems to reflect a particular moment in the development of civilization, not so much the time of humanity's creation per se, but of a somewhat later moment when people first learned the secret of agriculture, and so ceased to live in what anthropologists call hunter-gatherer society. So he ties all of this in with sort of the expulsion from the garden, which is very concerned with seed. God tells Adam and Eve that they will have to toil the ground for their food. So when people realize that you planted a seed and it grew into a plant that you could eat, they transitioned into this farming, agricultural based society. And also, when God says to Eve, "You'll have pain in childbirth," that reflects a recognition of the seed of man, sperm or semen being planted within the woman and growing a child later. So it all sort of reflects how we began to understand farming and agriculture. We began to wear clothes and we began to live in families. So again, when Eve is subject to her husband, her desire will be for her husband and she will bear children for him in pain. Again, that sort of reflects this transition to understanding more about how pregnancy occurred and understanding more about or becoming more of an agricultural based farming society. So understanding those differences, I want to move on to one of the key players in the creation story, and that is God. So for that, I'm going to turn to Jack Miles' God, a Biography. And part of what I found so fascinating and so revelatory, I guess, about Miles' work is that his thesis is that something he presents is this thesis that the Hebrew Bible presents God and humankind in this cosmic struggle for control of humankind fertility. So again, going back to this expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and the pain that Eve will have to have in childbirth, and the idea that it's a story about farming, not so much a story about creation, sort of affirms this reading that he has of the Hebrew Bible, and affirms this idea that God and humankind are engaged in this struggle at first because of the seed. And so when we're expelled from the garden, we must bear children. And also because the first thing that in the first story that God says, the only commandment that the God in the first priestly text gives to Adam and Eve is to go forth and multiply. So we'll talk about all those things just a tiny bit more in depth. I want to flesh these out a little more. Let's see. Miles begins by studying the creation story in which the Bible says, let me turn here to page 28. God said, this is in the first account, or the priestly account, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that are on the earth. And God created man in his image. In the image of God he created him. Both male and female he created, or excuse me, not both. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, Be fruitful and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule fish of the sea and birds of the sky and all the living things." He goes on to say, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant." Miles asks us to pay particular attention to God's demand for reproduction. In his book, he writes, why give man this commandment? Why fertility and increase? Because when humans reproduce, they are the image of their creator in his creative act. Reproduction produces reproductions, images. Don't children resemble their parents? The motive for all that precedes the creation of mankind is ultimately provision for that culminating act by which God creates another kind of creator. To repeat, God makes a world because he wants mankind, and he wants mankind because he wants an image. So Miles goes on to address the second story of creation presented in the Bible, and characterizes Yahweh God in this version as a much more anxious God who does not want an image as we see the God of the first chapter wants, but rather wants company. We see this this desire for company for humankind in the garden, when God appears after Adam and Eve have eaten the forbidden fruit, and he calls out, "Where are you?" So he's searching for company. Um, um, and there are other differences in these two texts that Miles believes characterizes God. I mean, like we've like some of the others have written about, the God of the first chapter is God, whereas when he appears in the second rewriting, or I'm sorry, the second chapter, and when we restart the creation story, he's no longer God, he's Yahweh God. And this is a name that it only appears in the Bible elsewhere after God has revealed himself as Yahweh God, has said, "My name is Yahweh." Um, so this is the only time that it kind of appears um, out of sequence. I'm forgetting that word. So anyway, there are some other differences that Miles believes characterizes God. For instance, he creates Eve. Uh, I'm sorry, while in the first account, he just demands that they go forth and multiply. In the second story, we find out from the voice of Eve when speaking to the serpent that God has given them another commandment, and that is to not eat from the tree of good and evil, because they will die. I want to take a moment to note that the Bible's text does not describe the serpent as Satan. He's not even described as evil, but according to the translation, shrewd, or clever, or crafty. Which leads us to believe that he has, because he's clever or shrewd, or he has knowledge, so maybe he has eaten from the tree of knowledge. Thus he knows that they will not die if they eat from it, which he explains to Eve. Eve says, we've been told that if we eat from this tree we will die, and Satan says, no, you won't. And we can kind of believe him because he is described as the craftiest of all animals, so he's the smartest, and obviously he had to get his knowledge from somewhere. Miles points out that though traditionally the serpent has gotten the bad rap for leading humans astray, the serpent here is speaking the truth about the tree, and it's God who has lied. The humans don't die upon eating the truth, but they continue to live. As a matter of fact, Adam lives almost 1,000 years. So the theological explanation for this is that the creation story, when God tells Adam and Eve that they're going to die, it's a metaphorical death, that they're dying a spiritual death because they're no longer sinless and pure, which again, they're never described as sinless or pure. I said again, I don't know if I already said that, but they're not ever described as sinless or pure in the Garden of Eden. Nowhere does it say that they fall from grace. Nowhere does it say that they were sinless. Rather, when God expels them, he says you'll have to suffer, and you'll die. So, however, it does say that, what we do have is the Bible saying, Eve saying that she is going to die if she eats this, and Satan saying, no, you won't. They do eat it. They don't die a physical death. So Kugel said that this was a concern of ancient interpreters. They couldn't understand why why Adam and Eve didn't die like God said they would. So he writes that at a certain point, someone thought of connecting the problem of Adam and Eve living on after they eat of the fruit with a certain verse in the book of Psalms. The psalmist here is contrasting God's eternal existence with the fleeting years that humans live, and he writes, "For 1,000 years in your sight are as of yesterday, the way it passes, or like a watch in the night." That's Psalm 94. The point clearly is that God's eternal, but the ancient interpreter held used this verse as the key to explaining why or how Adam and Eve died the day that they ate of the fruit, the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge. Because if in God's sight a day is actually 1,000 years, then for Adam to live almost 1,000 years, Kugel writes that he was 930 years old when he died. That would be equivalent to one day in God's years. So I think beyond this whole problem of dying immediately or dying spiritual death or dying 1,000 years from now. Um, I think what I most liked about Miles' reading was the irony that he points out that this serpent um, whose information leads to the expulsion from the garden is telling the truth, and God's lied to his creation. So, he asks, like, why would God do that? Why would God lie about this? And he presents sort of the problem um, of monotheism. In a polytheistic society, you could have another god come in and would be just as powerful as your first god and serve as sort of an adversary. And the serpent presents a problem in monotheism because he's able to trick God's creation, and he is working as an adversary, and therefore he's sort of subjugating, sort of undermining God's sovereignty and God's power. And that is a real problem, I think, in the monotheistic view, that you have a God that's all powerful, and yet his power is undermined by one of his own creations. So Miles actually kind of posits that perhaps this serpent isn't evil after all, but instead is acting as the unwitting agent of God. That perhaps God, this was all sort of part of God's plan, and that he was using one of his creatures in manipulation to the other. So, oops. So, Miles then looks to God's reaction after the humans disobey to characterize God. Miles sees God's reaction as a little bit overdramatic, and when we read God's words, which appear in Genesis 3:14 through 19, and he says, "Cursed be the ground because of you. By toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it sprout for you. By your food shall be the grasses of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread, until you return to the ground, for from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return." And he says, "Dirt you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and heirs. They shall strike at your head, and they will strike at your heel." And he says to the woman, "I will make you most severe your pangs in childbirth. In pain should you bear children. Yet your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." So it's just this very passionate, very anthropomorphic expression of fury and anger and regret. And Miles suggests that everything hangs on Adam and Eve's obedience to this one very deceptive commandment, this one commandment that is clothed in a lie, and that God's outrage once he banishes Adam and Eve from the garden causes him to feel great regret. And he writes that this regret is demonstrated in the fact that God makes clothes for Adam and Eve after he expels them, and he says, you're going to suffer, you're going to have pain in childbirth, you're going to have to work all the days of your life, or else you'll starve to death. He makes them clothes. And so, Miles asks, why spare them the inconvenience of making their own clothes if you've spared them all, or if you've subjected them to all this other sorrow. And he writes, why, if not because, to speak very simply, he feels bad about it all. The Lord God might have performed any other number of parting services for the man and woman as he drove them out of the garden. He may have fed them, for example, or he might have instructed them on what lay ahead. Though created as adults, they were newborn in the world and helpless. He might certainly have said something to them in mitigation of the curses still ringing in their ears. He might, above all, have explained why he had to do what he did, because it is a mystery. But he does none of that. Yet there is inherent tenderness and poignancy in what he does do, choosing to make his parting gesture the covering of their nakedness. He, again, going back to the whole craftsman idea of God, he makes their clothes, and he actually covers their nakedness. He clothes them himself. So let's talk more about the clothes. After they eaten the forbidden fruit, their eyes are open and they see that they're naked. They feel desire for each other, and because of that desire, they feel shame and cover themselves. Miles posits that an animal may feel desire for another animal, but he's not aware of his desire. Whereas when Adam looks upon Eve and sees her naked for the first time, he's very aware that he wants her, and he feels shame about that. And Miles suggests something again that's just I found revolutionary, and that is that perhaps maybe the reason that this sin was so great was that it allowed them to feel desire, and that this desire, human desire, makes them more perfect. So going back to the God that Miles has described as creating humans because he wanted company, remember, where are you? He desired them enough to create them, and now they understand desire and can understand what motivation God had that led to their own creation. So Miles posits that when God at the end of this myth says they've become like us, that's sort of what he means, that now humans understand desire and love. But the desire that Adam and Eve feel has been celebrated by modern religious traditions in a very different context, and that is as sort of this ideal of human desire within marriage. So whenever, I guess, modern Christian, Judeo-Christian religious teachers talk about biblical marriage, which is something that's covered in Unprotected Text by Jennifer Nutt's, they talk about the love between Adam and Eve as something that was just perfect and natural and this God-given great desire. And indeed, God states in, let's see, this is Genesis 2:24. Therefore a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And after their eyes are open to desire, God says to Eve, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So Nutt's reading of this is that, in Unprotected Text, is that the two passages are suggesting two principles that are sort of commonly held by modern interpreters, and that is that sex unites man and woman in one flesh, and that the desire to have sex is based from the fact that man and woman once shared a flesh because Eve came from Adam's rib. And that secondly, in marriage, women must be subordinate to their husbands. Their obedience to their husbands is actually rooted in the very desire that they feel for them, because God says, "Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." So Nuns points out, uses these stories to point out the contradiction in these principles. So in the first story, what we have in Genesis 1, God creates humankind all at once. This is really fascinating. Male and female, he created them. Adam is the Hebrew word that Nuns translates as humankind, which is sort of more of a literal translation of that word, rather than the proper name, Adam. So Nun suggests that in this reading of the first chapter, in her reading of the first chapter, the first human is neither male nor female, but of, quote, discernible gender. So the account of sex as an attempt to reunite as one flesh that they once shared is disproved by the creation account in the first story. They can't be of one flesh if they were created at the same time. So Nuns writes that most of modern understanding of God's view of human sexuality is based on these chapters, so it's really important that we understand what the text actually is saying. Um, Nuns writes about how this story is used in modern Christian tradition to espouse God's approval of the love between a man and his wife, and it sort of positions marriage and sex within marriage, not outside of marriage, but within it, as a gift from God. Not so, says Nuns. The text actually affirms male desire because, again, as we read, it is man, it's Adam, man, who's going to leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. So it affirms male desire, since he's taking the initiative to leave and become one with his wife. But it roots female desire in subordination to a husband, for whom she must now bear children in pain. Thus, Nunst sort of proposes that in this text in the Bible, or in this part of the Bible, female desire is a punishment, not a gift. So this whole notion that, sex is glorious as long as you're married, basing it off these texts is a problem with that reading. So what I found most fascinating about Nunn's research was she describes how ancient rabbis read these two creation stories concerning the creation of humanity. So if you're familiar with Plato's Symposium, and particularly the speech of Aristophanes, this is going to sound really familiar, which is, I think, why it's so fascinating to me that we find it in both of these texts. Late antiquity rabbis believed that the first creation, or the creation of human, in the first chapter of Genesis, when God created them male and female, he created one human with two faces, and the genitalia of both male and females, and that later, when the Bible says, he took Eve from Adam's rib, that he's actually splitting the two in half. So in this reading, the first human is androgynous, possessing both male and female sexual organs, and Nunst continues to reveal that this belief in an androgynous first human was familiar in early Christian society too. So early Christians believed that Christ came to overcome the separation between male and female and reunite the two sexes in one. Thus, when the Apostle Paul writes in Galatians 3:28 that in Christ there is no male and female, he, like others, is asserting the belief that God's elect will return one day to this original state of humanity, that is, the androgynous state of possessing both sexes, or both sexual organs, rather. And so this belief was that once the Christians, the elect, entered their heavenly bodies, they would return to that form, that androgynous form. So what we have in the beginning is, quite frankly, far messier than what we've perhaps been taught, at least what I was taught, which is what I recapped in the beginning for you. The creation myth is one that combines these two starkly different stories into one. The stories have different God characters and who possess different qualities and characteristics. And further, we have these fascinating elements dealing with the evolution of humanity and dealing with human sexuality in ways that we haven't probably considered in the past. And we also have elements of folklore that allow us to engage these texts with other ancient myths in order to sort of gain a greater appreciation for how the people of antiquity, and for specifically in the Hebrew Bible, how our ancient Israelites defined their beginnings, how they wrote their beginnings. And so, in Borg we see sort of why maybe they wrote it that way, because they were trying to assert their God's sovereignty. And in Kugel, we discovered that they were also attempting to explain that moment in the course of human history when we stopped being hunter-gatherers and started being farmers. And so we see, how we've struggled to define our beginnings, and how we've struggled to define perhaps what we wanted God to be. So the reason that I wanted to study this in this video is not only because the creation story is so well known and easily recognized, but also because, as familiar as it is, what I've learned from these authors and presented in this video is that this text is very surprising. It can be very fresh and very new and reveal a lot of different things about the concerns of ancient humanity. And so under this, I feel understanding these different interpretations of the creation myth allows us to fully appreciate the Bible for its complexity and its richness. In these 3 chapters, we can see that this text is evocative and puzzling and just anything but cut and dry or black and white. So, I think something that this research shows, as well as the research from all of these texts, something that sort of all of these texts assert is that if we want to continue to appreciate the Bible as a sacred text, as something that's important and revelatory about human nature, we must put an end to this common modern day trend of simplifying the Bible and trying to look at it as a cut and dry map or guide for life. And that we must accept the ambiguity that's present. And it's, I guess the reason I wanted to do this creation story is that it's the very beginning. It's 3 short chapters, but it's vast and it's ambiguous and it's complex. And it's conflicting. And in order to fully appreciate what it is, we have to accept and embrace its conflicting nature. And by doing that, I think we really appreciate the beauty of the written text. So thank you for watching the video. If you've made it this far, I just commend you. And thanks for engaging this study with me. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a really eye-opening, wonderful experience. And I just want to invite you to continue to engage in this conversation that these wonderful authors have started and have invited us into, and continue to explore this text yourself and ask yourself how, in 2012, how do we read the Bible? I hope that some of what I've presented today will help guide further studies and further interest into what these writers have to say. And I will post a list of the books that I referenced in this video today on the blog. So, thank you.